giving eugenics, right? That's not a great thing to be perpetuating. That's not the vibe. So especially in the year 2025 in our political climate, let's not. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name's Mickey. I'm a therapist, and we talk about therapy things on this channel. And today we are talking about the rapture because if you're on the same side of TikTok that I am, you saw this past week that there was a hullabaloo on TikTok about what at that time was an impending rapture, and then there were other people talking about those people who were talking about the rapture. So there's a lot going on. I guess what happened is that there was a South African priest who predicted that the rapture would take place on September 23rd.
Rapture is a bonus.
Which at this point, clearly that was a lie. But there were a lot of people who kind of latched on to this prediction because he said that he had like communed with God and had been given definitive proof that this was happening. And so all of this went like viral on TikTok. There were people selling their cars. There were people buying up Dollar Tree Bibles in droves and like laminating instructions for all of us sinners after the rapture happened. There was one lady who was like canning food and putting out survival guides for her husband because she didn't think his ass was going to get raptured, which like, is it a little funny in the way that like absurd things are sort of like unbelievable? Yes. And also, I do want to talk about this in a serious way because I know, especially if you are like, if you've been around for a minute, like we've all seen the billboards, right? The end is nigh, like all of those things. It's sort of a cliche. It's kind of a joke, and we're sort of used to it in the way that we're like, no, it's not. And so it's easy for us to kind of write that off, right? And I think as a professional, there's some stuff that I wanted to talk about, mostly that the phrase religious psychosis was flying around. So I have thoughts. I want to talk about that a little bit because I have some maybe controversial feelings. So let's just get into that. Okay, so from the jump, let's be clear. The DSM-5, the ICD-10, there's no like standardized definition for what religious psychosis is, or like defining that as like a distinct phenomenon. The APA does define religious delusions as any delusion associated with religious beliefs and grandiose ideas with religious content. So that's a thing. But this was part of why I wanted to talk about it, because there are a lot of people using the phrase religious psychosis in a way that like sort of conveys a formality around it. And I just wanted to set the record straight that that's not a formal or sort of defined thing. Can people be suffering symptoms of psychosis that also are of the religious flair? Absolutely, yes, right? I don't think that's surprising to anybody. The reason I want to talk about this, though, if you've been here for a minute, you will know that I have strong feelings about folks using language responsibly. And if you're not, hi, I'm probably going to be annoying to you, because the importance around mental health language to me is paramount, not just because it's important for us to like use the right words and phrases, but also because we've seen kind of this weird trend happening where people are weaponizing therapy words and like weaponizing therapy speak to sort of do this weird thing where we're looking down our nose at each other and kind of like from up on high. And I don't love that. As a professional, it's important that we use therapy language for therapy purposes. And so it's not that people who aren't therapists can't use the language. That's not what I'm saying. But just that if we're going to speak about, for example, a widespread mental health phenomenon, we should be doing it from a place of compassion and empathy, not a place of like public ridicule. That's not helpful. For what it's worth, delusions, to sort of define that specifically, delusions are when we believe things that aren't real. So the rapture being a thing that somebody really, truly, genuinely believes is going to happen can fall under the category of a delusion. The common example of this in therapy literature is like the sort of classic, somebody believes that there is a person inside their TV who's sending them messages, right? And for what it's worth, some of these people were making TikToks talking about how like they saw a license plate the day before the predicted rapture, and some of the digits on it added up to 923, which is 923, and so therefore the rapture is happening on September 23rd, right? Or like there was one man who, I'll show you the footage, but his Bible of the Day app told him that Mark 923 was the verse of the day, and so that was clearly a message.
Tell me why the night before September 23rd, tell me why we get Mark 923. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes.
Everything is possible for one who believes. That means the rapture is possible if we believe in it. 923.
This is sort of a classic example of what a delusion can look like. I'm going to be clear. We're not diagnosing anybody because that's not allowed. And also, quite frankly, I can't do that. Diagnosis is a soft science anyways, but especially to do it with a person that you don't know, that you have no idea what their symptoms or environment or like surrounding circumstances are, wholly irresponsible and, in my opinion, impossible. So this is not that. This is me taking objective data and talking to you about a way that it could be a good example for what something might look like in real life. We're doing applied learning here. I also want to talk about psychosis because that can also include hallucinations, which is either seeing or hearing things that aren't real or that aren't objectively taking place, right? And some of these people do talk about hearing voices or hearing messages from God, seeing visions of Christ. And for what it's worth, that's like not uncommon necessarily in especially like the very charismatic, evangelical, like Pentecostal type of Christian sects. And so that's not necessarily to say that all of those people who experience those things are having psychotic episodes, which I think is a great segue for us to talk about. Let's take a moment because it's important that we differentiate between delulu and delusional, right? Those are separate, and clinical delusions are a clinical diagnosis for a reason, I think, obviously. But also somebody can be a little bit like delusional in the sort of colloquial way without that being a clinical diagnosis, right? Just because I might believe that the guy who's not texting me back does actually really like me doesn't mean that I'm suffering from clinical delusions. That's an important distinction, and I want to encourage people to keep this in mind when we have large-scale discourse about these things, because we do this thing, I just talked about this, but we do this thing where we assign clinical terms to everyday people without, first of all, like any credentials. And so like that's especially bad. But even as a person with the credentials, very much no. We just talked about how you can't and shouldn't be doing that. And so especially trying to do that in this way that is like very judgmental and condescending and very like, I am better than you, or I am like more mentally healthy than you, and so therefore that makes me a better person than you. It's giving eugenics, right? That's not a great thing to be perpetuating. That's not the vibe. So especially in the year 2025 in our political climate, let's not weaponize language that has to do with somebody's mental health in a way that conveys an attitude of like less worthiness because somebody might be struggling with a mental health episode or crisis. And also, again, I want to be clear, are some of these people possibly experiencing like clinical psychosis or religious delusions? Sure, possibly. It seems like a lot of the symptoms might line up, and so I could see how that could be happening, right? But does that mean that everybody who is under the impression that a rapture might be happening is clinically diagnosable with delusions or psychosis? Not necessarily. It is also important for us to talk about how easily malleable the human brain is. We talked about this in the cults video, actually. If you haven't watched it, I'll put it up here. Our biology is fairly easy to manipulate. I know that sounds sort of crazy, but it is. Our brains are fairly easy to like poke and prod the right series of buttons to get us to believe things and participate in things and get swept away with things, right? And especially religion is a very popular vehicle for that to happen. And so this whole phenomenon is sort of like fascinating. It is also very sad, but I think it's like a useful example of the way that religion especially harms people and harms people's mental health, because this could have been avoided, right? There's no reason for religious leaders to be predicting things like this in a way that is going to cause panic and anxiety and a frenzy and like a legitimate mental health crisis for a lot of people. In the hullabaloo of RaptureTok, there have also been quite a few people who've spoken out about the trauma of growing up in an environment and a religion like this, where there were sort of constant predictions about the rapture and constant discourse about the end of the world. We also talked about this in the cults video, that in religions and high control groups like this, there tends to be like an apocalyptic flare that happens. It's because it's an easy vehicle to control people. It's very easy as a cult leader to whip people into a crisis by leaning on the very human fear that we all have about our own inefficacy in the end of our lives, and especially like the end of our safety. So this happens a lot, and growing up in that environment is incredibly traumatizing. The long-term emotional and mental health impact of that I think, can't be overstated. We've talked about this on the channel before. Also, scrupulosity was the thing that came to mind for me first and foremost, because we've talked about it before. If you're not aware, scrupulosity is a subtype of OCD that is essentially OCD but related to religious matters. So there's a lot of like constantly interrogating yourself about whether something is a sin or whether you're a good person. And especially like if the rapture happened tomorrow, would you go to heaven thing? That can be employed in scrupulosity as well. You're also going to see a lot of like intrusive thoughts, images about death, about hell, about damnation. There's sort of a constant reassurance seeking that happens with this also, and needing to like be consoled or reassured about your holiness or your worthiness or whether you're doing it right. It's kind of symptoms of this type of anxiety really is truly awful. It's one of the things that I think people don't talk about enough in regards to religious trauma. And so for folks with that diagnosis, for example, to get swept up in something like RaptureTok doesn't necessarily mean they're suffering psychosis. They might be struggling with a different mental illness that causes them to be pretty fanatically invested in something like whether the rapture is coming or not. Fundamentalist religion and like the sort of legalistic application of that can also cause things like anxiety disorder. I mean, many types of anxiety disorders, but also panic disorder is worth mentioning. If you grew up in an environment like this and you find that you experience panic attacks a lot, that could be a contributor, because the fear-mongering and the threats that exist in like this type of Christianity specifically are very traumatizing to an underdeveloped brain, especially because your frontal lobe was not equipped to deal with the complexity of such an emotionally heavy issue. So your poor little brain was trying to make peace with all of these like very heavy and very adult things in a way that it didn't know how to. So that sticks with you, right? That does something to a person. And if you experience that or you're realizing that about yourself, please know that you're very valid in your symptoms. First of all, you're not being dramatic. You're not a baby. You're not like, whatever, all the mean things that people say to you. You're very valid in needing the help that you need. And I really want to encourage people to feel empowered and safe to seek that help, because there are also, for what it's worth, a lot of therapists who are specifically equipped to deal with religious trauma and things like that. And there's a lot of really wonderful work that can be done that helps you to be able to live your life in a way that isn't constantly overwhelming. I do think I would also be remiss to not mention the concern about harm to self in the wake of the rapture not coming, because very cult-like beliefs like this type of Christianity sometimes lend themselves to the flavor of like, maybe this was a test to see if I'm committed enough, right? What was it, Abraham with his son? That's kind of like the energy here. Or maybe I didn't go, maybe other people did, but I didn't go because I didn't believe hard enough, or I didn't try hard enough, or I didn't pray exactly the correct way that I was supposed to. There's almost a very like Paul and Morgan Girl Defined flair to this, right? Of like, if something bad happens to you, anything bad that happens to you, it's a consequence of your moral failings or lack of faith. And so therefore you should X, Y, Z, whatever. And in this circumstance, I do think there is a very real possibility for harm to self and the completion of that harm to self. I'm trying not to say words that get me, whatever, you get it. And so that's another important consideration when we talk about things like this, because also, for what it's worth, the shame and the embarrassment of having spoken publicly, pretty emphatically, about something like this, like the clarity after a mental health crisis, can be debilitating. And the potential for harm here is very high. And I think that's also why it's important for us to be fucking nice. Obviously, again, like there's a part of it that is almost like sort of in the way that it's like a ha-ha in a sort of incredulous way, right? In a way that it's like absurd and confusing. But I want to encourage people to not use other people's mental health crises as entertainment, right? It's not funny. It's actually quite cruel, I think, to make a joke and a production and a show out of other people's suffering. Memeing other people having a mental health breakdown is also not very kind, and it's also not very community minded. For what it's worth, also, especially if you are a person who has now or ever struggled with any type of mental illness or like neurodivergence especially, I would encourage you to keep in mind that kicking somebody while they're down is only funny when it's not happening to you, right? It's not it's important. You get it. We're not going to go on a tangent about it. We're going to keep it moving. But I want to encourage people to reflect on the core values that you have as good people and let that guide you moving forward. So for what it's worth, actually, if you're looking for something that is actually funny, then you should come play bingo with us. It's a silly little haha game that we play when we stream Love is Blind, and that will be happening for the entirety of October on Fridays. We play bingo because it's entertaining. We also raise money for charity while we're doing it. So come hang out with us. You can join the Discord also at the Snosh Blossoms level or higher, either here or on Patreon. So that's also fun and funny. We have lots of memes and silly things. So come hang out. Do like actually funny, silly things with us. Regardless, if you guys like the video, you can subscribe. We make content like this and pop culture stuff, clearly. So come stay for that. And then share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.